Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about closing the ESG commitment gap between investors and corporate directors. And joining me as a familiar face, please welcome Cindy Fornelli, who's a first-time board member with Triple Point Venture Growth BDC Corp., otherwise known as TPVG. And she's also the former executive director for the Center for Audit Quality. Welcome back, Cindy.
Thanks, TK, and hello, viewers. It's wonderful to be back inside America Boardrooms with you, TK.
So now you've gone, so all those years you were working with boards and working on board issues and whatever, and no surprise, after you left the center, you were asked to serve on a board to bring all that experience. And in addition to that experience, you also have regulatory experience, and that was with the SEC, and you also had experience with Bank of America, which gave you the company experience. So with all that experience, you join a board, and what was the first issue or challenge that you underestimated that sort of was an aha moment?
Well, you're exactly right. So I do view board service as kind of closing that circle, if you will, and having that be the piece that I was missing before. And the biggest aha moment is that being on a board is both new and familiar at the same time. So it's a bit of both. And what I mean by that is, as an executive, I was used to being in the boardroom, but of course, the board was setting the strategy, and it was my job with my team to implement that strategy. And now the roles are reversed, and it's my job working with my fellow board members to help management direct management and set the strategy, and then have them execute on that strategy. So it's different in that way. And I take that very seriously, though, in that to me, there was nothing more frustrating as an executive than being given strategy that was unexecutable, if you will. So I view one of the things that I bring to the board, along with my fellow board members, is helping management understand what the strategy is, but making sure that it's executable and that they're able to execute against that strategy. So that is both something that is very important to me, but that my prior experience helps me to do, I think, as a board member.
Well, again, I don't think that normal first-time board members have quite the background or training that you might have experienced over all those years, but it's still new for everybody when they get that opportunity to go in. So that's an interesting observation. So we wanted to talk about ESG, and all the studies that we've seen recently still show that there's a gap between how investors, particularly institutional investors, feel about ESG and about sitting board members. So my question to you is, how do you think that the best boards are tackling ESG? And as a qualifier, I think I understand the approach to things like diversity, but when you bring in issues like culture or cancer culture or social injustice, I think that presents an interesting challenge for boards. So what's your perspective?
Well, I think both the COVID crisis and the social justice, Black Lives Matter movement, which started it, and then it grew to include other social injustices, have really shined a spotlight, put a spotlight on the haves and the have-nots in our country and frankly around the world. And so you're right. I think that investors are tuning into that and looking at that more carefully and flexing their muscles, if you will, and have announced that in a very vocal way that they're going to start holding corporate board members accountable for those types of things. And so you've seen after particularly the George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor incidents over the summer, a number of CEOs of large corporations come out with statements saying that their companies are going to be committed to doing better in the diversity area and the social justice area. I think we're at the point where talking isn't just enough. You need to have action against that. And so given that investors are looking to boards of directors to help to make sure that these things are addressed within a corporation and announce that they're going to start holding directors accountable, there are things that boards of directors can do to help make sure that that's happening. And one of them would be to look at what's our corporate mission. Does that need to be addressed? If we have benchmarks that the company wants to implement, the board should consider tying pieces of compensation to meeting those challenges that the board and the company has set for itself in doing better in these areas. So I think there are concrete actions that boards can take to help companies do better in these areas and hold themselves accountable as a company and as a board, addressing the needs of investors and society at large.
So let me take another look and create a scenario with this ESG. So we pretty much can expect for the Biden administration to further support this concept of stakeholder relations, okay? Where we've expanded to make sure communities and suppliers and are added to what I'll call the core, which is shareholders, employees, and customers. And in my interactions with boards over the 30 plus years that I've been doing it, I think that board members understand the balance between customers, shareholders, and employees. I mean, they don't always execute well, but I think they understand that for sustainability to be a viable company moving forward, they need to have a balance of those issues. Again, they don't always execute that well, but I think that they understand that. And so they understand the basics of sustainability. But now comes along ESG, and we expand stakeholder relations, and we add these other issues like the social injustice and those issues in. And all of a sudden, we're seeing in the research still that this is where there's the gap. Okay, there's a gap between the sitting directors and the institutionals. Now, let's assume that you and other new board members are coming in that are younger than the sitting board members that are existing on the board, and you see that there's this gap, and you have to get this group. Okay, you have to help motivate and move this group to accept ESG, which it's not like it's coming, it's here. Okay, so people that don't address that are going to get passed by, and then you're going to have a catch up. So the challenge of how does directors on a board, particularly new directors, sort of influence this more staid group of directors, the importance of sort of moving with the times at a pace than maybe they're more comfortable with, particularly when you're changing strategies and including things in comp and all the things that are good practices.
Well, you're being very diplomatic there, because it is a fine line, right? There's a reason that the existing board members are there for their acumen and their expertise, but there's also a reason why a newer board member has brought in, and part of that is to bring a different perspective. So one thing I would think would be important to do is to, first of all, have a level setting conversation with the entire board about regulation. So you mentioned we have a new administration. There are expectations that perhaps the Biden administration, whomever the new SEC chair is going to be, because we know Jay Clayton is leaving, that there might be more focus on ESG issues and on investor issues. And so I think having a discussion around at the board, around how regulation is going to probably be changed with this new administration, and how, when we're talking about disclosure, because I think right now that's what investors are really, really focused on, laser focused on, is the company disclosing what its ESG policies are, what its metrics are, and how it's planning on meeting those metrics. And so when we're talking about disclosures, you know this from past discussions that we've had, it's so much, I think, better to have voluntary disclosures than it is to have mandated disclosures, because that way the company can look at what's going on in the company at that particular moment and tailor the disclosures to the needs of the company and its investors at that time. And so I think if board members understand that, that's the first step in trying to move to enhanced disclosures around ESG. Another thing that I think would be a good step for a board member to take, a newer board member who is focused on this, is maybe to volunteer to lead the efforts to investigate what enhanced ESG disclosure would look like, to report back to the board as a whole and management. And then if the board appoints you as that role, my next step would be to sit down with the corporate secretary and with investor relations and understand what are perceived impediments to enhancing disclosures. Why wouldn't we want to enhance our disclosures voluntarily to talk more about the issues that our investors care about? And I suspect what you might hear as an impediment, because we've heard this before, is why give more than what is required under the regulation? And we just talked about one reason is because investors want it. So why not meet that investor demand? Another reason that we also just discussed is better that we do it voluntarily than have the government tell us how to do it. And so a third one, though, is, well, nobody else is doing it. And that's where I think the corporate secretary and investor relations can be very helpful. You can go out and survey what are other companies doing, particularly in your segment or your industry. And I would almost guarantee that unless you're best in class, you are going to find other companies that are your competitors that are enhancing their disclosures. And so that can give comfort that you're not leading the pack, that you are in best practices or leading practices, but perhaps not on the very, very cutting edge. Although there's nothing wrong with being on the cutting edge. And then I think investor relations can help, would be part of that team, in understanding what investors really want. And so doing some research and seeing what do your particular investors want, and maybe trying to set up a scenario where you could meet and the other board members could meet with those investors to really understand what it is that they want. And I think more importantly, understand what it is that they're not necessarily asking for. I think when we hear enhanced disclosures around ESG, people are afraid that you're going to give away competitive advantage, corporate strategy that you normally wouldn't give out publicly. And I don't think that's what your investors are wanting. I think they're just wanting more transparency around what the company is doing and how the company is holding itself accountable. And I think that's where a board can be really, really helpful, is understanding that and helping the disclosure team understand that. And then if your whole board isn't there yet, you as the volunteer working with investor relations, working with the corporate secretary to understand this and gather data can be very, very helpful. And I think this is really important for a company, particularly those companies that might be having activists looking at them. I think this is going to be something that activists are going to look into, are those companies that don't have good ESG disclosures. I think that makes you more vulnerable.
Well, I'm certainly in your camp for promoting for voluntary disclosure. You know that I've never liked the mandated disclosures because they end up getting lawyered up, and you can pull out 100 proxies and the mandated disclosures don't have two words that are different in describing, what is happening. And that to me
Right.
is
It's very
just,
boilerplate.
yeah, it's not worthwhile. So, I'm certainly a not a fan of that. And just general disclosure, I would rather see people sort of putting more pressure. If you're going to put pressure on actually doing something behind the disclosure. I remember when the risk of compensation came out, everybody's explanation of the risk was the same, in the mandated disclosures. I feel
Well,
the same
that's
way. I feel the same
go
way
ahead.
about a matrix. The matrix are done by the corporate secretary, and sometimes people aren't qualified. I I wholeheartedly agree with your voluntary, and I people shouldn't be afraid to be on the cutting edge. Okay, sometimes you'll get some nice credit for that, and who cares if you're on the cutting edge? If it makes sense for your company, who cares what other companies are doing or not doing? Do what's right
Well,
for your
that's the
company.
hard part, right, about voluntary disclosures is that it takes more effort because you have to think about what's best for my company. What is the company doing right now? And it shines a spotlight, if you're going to do it well, on maybe areas that need to be enhanced. Where if you just go the cookie cutter route, it is much more of a rote routine and a check the box exercise. And so, but I think it's better for investors, it's better for companies, and it's better for the company's long term growth and health if you do that hard work. And I really think that the board can show real leadership here and working with investor relations, working with the corporate secretary, working with the disclosure team to move the dial in a meaningful way without exposing risk or exposing your own risk and enhancing your risk, or without, I think, drawing undue attention to yourself, other than the good types of attention that when you're the leading or a leading company in this area, good attention comes your way. It's something that your investors want. So that's the primary reason why companies and boards need to consider doing this.
Well, Cindy, I think all of this is good advice. It's going to be interesting to see what happens down the road. It's going to be interesting to see how the Delaware courts and the legal fits into this. It's going to be interesting to see what early adopters, do relative to the compensation. And we're seeing some great metrics come out of the World Economic Forum and SASB and all that. So I have faith that this will work itself through, but it's not. It's going to need board help, and it's going to need a challenge. So I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us today and offering that great advice.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be back.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.